Thank you guys so much for joining us. We are really excited to share this presentation with you. I'm especially excited because, as most of you might know, I started my career working as an assistant media planner on Unilever 15 or so years ago, and most of my marketing education came from Unilever over those last 15 years. As Luis mentioned, this is the third season of Media Dystopia, and it's also the final season, so we're trying to wrap things up. So since we were inspired by a TV show, we decided to do a little video to bring you up to speed for those of you who may not have seen the previous 2 seasons. So,
previously on Media Dystopia.
The paradox is that while technology makes our lives better, it's also making us miserable.
We've reached the point of data collection that we can start to understand things about consumers' emotion.
All digital media will eventually be addressable, and all addressable media will eventually be traded programmatically.
40% of consumers say that they have bought a product simply because of the brand's position on social issues.
We're seeing an all-out arms race for sports broadcasting rights that includes many more players than ever before.
Great content isn't for everyone. It's for everyone that can pay for it.
We become increasingly comfortable giving up elements of our privacy in exchange for greater personalization.
Bravo has become one giant self-replicating spin-off of itself.
We have officially entered the voice age.
VR could be the advertising Garden of Eden. VR has the power to transport us to an entirely new world.
The more options that are available for a type of entertainment, the less viewership the most popular examples of that entertainment will get.
We also won't see many final episodes anymore. When every show has a chance to be resurrected, can we really call it a series finale?
Imagine a consumer who is not only almost completely unreachable because their media is consumed via ad-free subscriptions, but those subscriptions also include their Dove soap, Colgate toothpaste, and 2 dinners per month at Chili's.
The role for brands in this future will be to position themselves as a story experience outlet.
As more and more of us begin to listen to content before we ever, if we ever see it.
This idea is called the self-sovereign identity. Like if you had a passport for the digital world.
Brands can no longer decide if they want to pick sides.
Because it's not
too
far off
in our media dystopia.
as you can see, the project of Media Dystopia is all about what the future is going to be. And we don't mean the next 6 to 12 months. We mean the next 6, 12 to 18 years. And we did this because it could help prepare both us and our clients for that future. But we also did it because we thought it would be fun and it might inspire some ideas that we can start to put into action today. Very importantly, these are provocations and not predictions. In fact, we probably ask more questions than we provide answers. And we really did truly take Black Mirror as the inspiration point, because just like that show imagines these scary futures that you could kind of recognize how we got there, we took what we're seeing today in terms of changing consumer behavior and emerging technology and play them out to their most dramatic, extreme ends, sometimes to the point of hyperbole. In season 1, we looked at all of the external disruptions to the media and marketing landscape, things like voice technology or the changing landscape of entertainment consumption. And in season 2, we looked at more of the things that the industry had done to itself, things like drive people into ad-free models or the intersection of brands and politics. And as we're drawing to a close with our final season, like any good science fiction, we're starting to get a little bit more philosophical and asking the big questions about what it all really meant. But we also saw a stat that the success of Game of Thrones seasons is directly correlated with the amount of nudity in those seasons. So we have a content warning just to let you know that we're going to try and go out with a bit of a bang here. So we have 6 episodes to share. I'm going to kick us off and then periodically hand it over to Janet and Rachel so we can just jump right in. Each episode begins with a quick snapshot from this future before we back up and talk about how we get there and what it means for brands. And in this episode, which is called Just What I Needed, in 2026, HBO announces Game of Thrones Fan Edition, which is a remade final season based entirely on fan fiction. So this episode is also a riddle. And that riddle is, what does a hedgehog, a porn star, and a cherry Coke have in common? And hopefully by the end of this episode, you'll have the answer to that question. We could start with the Hedgehog. Has anyone seen what's gone on with the Sonic the Hedgehog movie? So for those of you who haven't, last February, Sony, the studio behind this, put out a trailer for the new Sonic the Hedgehog live-action movie. It got millions of views, but fans were horrified by the design of Sonic the Hedgehog, which you could see there on the left. They hated it so much, of course, they took to social media to air their angst. And within 3 days, the studio said, okay, we get it. We're going to push back to the release date of the movie and go back and redesign Sonic. And that is the new Sonic that you see on the left. On the new trailer that came out just a few weeks ago, the fans were very happy with the new design. They said, but we're going to hold final judgment, of course, until the movie comes out next February. But this is just the latest in the phenomenon of fan backlash against massive pieces of popular culture. Whether it is 1 million fans signing a petition for the Game of Thrones final season to be remade, or the Not My Star Wars movement in response to The Last Jedi, or the heralding of a fabled Snyder cut of Justice League, which was a massive failure of a movie that fans have been clamoring for, and nobody knows if that cut even exists. And in fact, yesterday it was announced, or it leaked, that Disney is planning to release a special director's cut of the latest Star Wars movie on Disney Plus, actually, to hopefully, potentially satisfy fans who were horrified by that movie. But the question is, how could we have gotten to a point where millions of fans could demand that a giant multinational corporation remake something that cost $100 million in the first place? And the answer might be the fact that consumers now have come to expect content not just for someone like them, but for them specifically. So if you are a huge hip-hop and gaming fan, you can listen to the rapper Mega Ran, who raps as a video game character. Or if you just like to look at pictures of people drinking water, then join the subreddit community Hydro Homies, because that is all that is there. Or if you've always longed for a gay remake of Pride and Prejudice set entirely on Fire Island, well, that content will be coming to new streaming service Quibi later this year. If you would like to watch videos of a guy painting miniatures on a weekly basis, you can subscribe to Ben Comet's feed. And if you want to read fan fiction about congressional members making love in aquariums, that actually might be a little bit too broad, because there are more than 3,000 stories on the internet that fit that exact description. The point is, we have gotten to a place where any content that people want, they can get. And we might as well call this episode the pornification of everything, because to a certain extent, this mirrors what's happened over the history of pornography, as it has continued to splinter into subgenre after subgenre after subgenre to appeal to very specific interests from consumers of that type of content. I don't just bring up porn for the sake of provocation, because, as many people know, porn is normally the driver of digital innovation. They were actually the first to crack digital payments more than a decade ago, and they largely cracked streaming technology, enabling a lot of the stuff that we are consuming on Netflix and Disney Plus and everything else like that today. And today they're also they're pioneering this new form of content in which their performers have direct relationships with their fans, which they are able to monetize by turning their own social profiles into gated paywalls, and they are able to monetize themselves in that way. And when we think about how that relates to the world of content at large, what that means is across all types of content, it's not just about verticals anymore, and it's not just about niches. All content consumption is going down to the level of fetish, the thing that you particularly are interested in, and only you. And largely in the porn industry, this is built on these platforms called FanCentro and OnlyFans. But those are only two of a number of emerging platforms that are enabling direct connection between creators of all kinds and consumers of all kinds. If you want, you can go onto Cameo and you can pay a celebrity as little as $10 to record a video specifically for you or your friends. Many people know of Kickstarter or Patreon. In fact, Patreon, going back to that guy who paints miniatures in his basement, he makes more than $5,000 per month from only 544 subscribers. He's basically able to sustain himself by building an audience of only 544 people. It's as if we have all become, as consumers, mini Medicis, able to commission works of art and entertainment that meet our exact specifications, the exact ways that we want them. Now, there's one other piece that's leading towards this future, which is the advances in technology for content production. Whether it is deep fakes or the ability to create a CGI rebirthing of a famous movie actor, or in the example of Black Mirror Bandersnatch, actual interactive video, all content can not only be updated to be specifically for you, but it can be updated in real time so that you are getting exactly what you need from that moment. So what all this means is between the fan empowerment and entitlements, plus the rise of the creator-consumer platforms, and the technology advances in content production, leads to a future where what we know as on-demand content evolves into made-to-order content, giving consumers exactly what they want. Now, this might sound like personalization, but it actually goes a step further, because right now, if we're honest, personalization just means we give the consumer a choice of however many options we can provide them. In this world, consumers are specifying what they want, and that is what they are getting. Comparing it to Goldilocks in the House of the Three Bears, instead of choosing between 3 porridges to find the just right one, she has a celebrity chef who is manning a porridge bar, giving her exactly what she wants. Every audience can now find a creator to suit their needs, and luckily every creator can find an audience for what it is they want to create. Take, for example, the story of Samantha Quek. Anyone familiar with, any of the Brits familiar with Samantha Quek? So she's a minor celebrity in the UK. She was a gold medal Olympian in field hockey and is now a sports presenter. She's also a massive fan of Liverpool Football Club. And last May, when Liverpool made the Champions League final, she was desperate to go to the game, but she's not of the level of celebrity where she could just snap her fingers and procure a ticket. So she turned to her moderate social following, and she posted on Twitter the following: to the weird guy who messaged me on Instagram saying he would do anything to hear me fart through a walkie-talkie, the time has come to see if you are a man of your word. Find me two well-priced tickets in the Champions League in the Liverpool section, and yes, it has come to this. What's amazing is she was still willing to pay for the tickets. She just needed help getting access to them. What's even more amazing is the guy, that weird guy, his name is Ashby Hope, and he replied almost immediately and said, "Who provides the walkie-talkies?" At which point negotiations began, and Samantha replied, "Option A, I provide the walkie-talkies, but I will only eat a light salad the night before. But if you, Ashby, provide the walkie-talkies, I will eat beans on toast before the event happens." Ashby replied with the walkie-talkies. She replied with a picture of her Heinz baked beans, and it was on. Unfortunately for us, this is where the Twitter thread runs dry, so we don't know exactly what happens next. But what we do know is that it turns out Ashby Hope wasn't the only person interested in this type of content, because other people started popping up, including this guy, who said, "What frequency will this be happening at? I'm just asking for a friend." So in a world where this can happen, things that are meant for the mainstream and are meant to be big are going to be few and far between. And there's really only going to be 1 or 2 things a year that rise up to the level of cultural dominance, because everyone is going to be focused on the stuff that they exactly want. Which means for us as brands, it's going to be increasingly difficult to borrow equity from those big media properties to reach people en masse and get that kind of brand presence that we want. That does mean, though, that those big properties like the NFL here in the States and probably something like the Champions League become even more valuable and expensive in the long run, because they're the only places where there is any true mass scale. On the other side, though, it does provide an opportunity for us to penetrate those tiny, tiny cultural moments by bundling ourselves or trying to find ways to patronize some of that content to make it easier for consumers to get there. And lastly, if you thought the idea of director's cuts was cool, wait until we have a future where there are infinite versions of every piece of content, including 8 new versions of the final season or the final episode of Game of Thrones, when Warner Media realizes that they can actually monetize the fan dissatisfaction that had been brewing for almost a decade, and in 2026 say, all right, we'll just make whatever you want and push it out. Now, this, luckily for us, or perhaps unfortunately for us, doesn't apply just to content. It also applies to the products and services that consumers are asking of us. So Kit Kat launched a bougie version of their candy bar, which costs $17, but you can specify up to 1,500 possible combinations of a Kit Kat. And going back even further, it's why the Coca-Cola Freestyle machine was very popular and continues to expand in its footprint, because it's enabling people to have the exact kind of soda that they want. But this is a very difficult world for brands to navigate, because we're not used to operating in this model, and even brands that seem to have cracked it might struggle. So let's compare for a second this Coca-Cola Twitter exchange with Samantha Quek's. Coca-Cola announced on social media the launch of their new Cinnamon Coke, and an apparent superfan, Professor X, wrote, "Ooh, cool, now do a vanilla Cinnamon Coke." And Coca-Cola responded, "We are unable to accept ideas for products or formula modifications from our friends outside of the company." What a fantastic brand engagement this was for this guy, Professor X, who was raising his hand as a superfan and got legalese right thrown back in his face. Now, they obviously had to do that for legal reasons, but it just makes you feel weird, right, as a marketer? But there's one other way that brands can get involved in this world. And this goes back to a sort of the 90s version of Game of Thrones, which was Neon Genesis Evangelion, which was a massive, massive hit in the anime space, largely in Asia, in the mid-90s. It had one season, and the final episode so disappointed fans that they were distraught. And there was angst at the level of Game of Thrones had this year. They were so distraught that eventually they wound up remaking it to satisfy fans. But before they did that, Schick licensed the characters to put them in a TV commercial. But more than just throwing in a commercial, they actually fixed the ending of the show in the commercial. And to this day, fans of Neon Genesis consider the Schick commercial ending to be the canon ending of this piece of content, which is an amazing thing for a brand to have delivered to their fans. So, all that said, how can Unilever prepare? The first is to place bets at both ends of the content spectrum. Those big things, those few things that still dominate culture are going to be really important, but we need to start finding those pockets of consumer influence. Second is explore how to patronize or bundle with some of these smaller content creators to create real value for niche fans. We've started conversations with both Kickstarter and Patreon to find a way that we can bring brands into that space without ruining it through advertising, but still making it and bring value. Third is thinking about how we can rebuild the innovation and supply chain pipeline to be better able to deliver against this made-to-order demands from consumers, and as part of that, get really, really good at listening, using the Coke example as a model of what not to do. And finally, think about the Schick model and find ways to create alternate versions through branded content. So that's episode 1, and now that we've loosened things up with some fart jokes, I'm going to have Rachel come up and do episode 2, which is going to make you really uncomfortable from the very start.
All right, episode 2 is called On the Basis of Code. And the snapshot for this future is that in 2027, Dove is sued by the ACLU for inadvertently buying ads that discriminate against women of color. Now, we're beginning this episode in potentially the least dystopian of places, which is a library. And our story begins with Dorothy Porter, who you see here on the screen. And Dorothy was a Howard University librarian in the 1940s. Dorothy, at this time, had just acquired a bunch of books from poets such as James Weldon Johnson. And after acquiring these books, she was told she needed to sort them using the Dewey Decimal System, which is the number-based classification system we've used for over 150 years to sort books. Now, although these books were poetry books, they explicitly did not belong in the poetry section, section 811. Instead, they belonged in section 325, which was the section about colonization. And the only difference between Johnson's book on the left and other poets like Charles Dickens was the color of the author's skin. Now, the Dewey Decimal System was created by a guy named Melville Dewey, and simply said he really, really sucked. He said that books that were written by LGBTQ people should be placed under mental derangement, section 132. He was also kicked out of the American Library Association for allegedly assaulting a number of women. So this guy was clearly problematic, and his system, although we still use it today, was biased. Which brings me to why we started in a library. Long before you Googled it or you asked Alexa, the way that people got information was by going to a library. So it's no wonder why, when up until quite recently, we had a system that segregated Black and gay writers from the rest of what one man deemed to be literature, that we get a whole new set of modern problems in the era of automation to give us information. Problems like this. And problems like this are a lot harder to contain because they're not based off of a guy named Melville Dewey. They're based off of algorithms. And algorithms are essentially just a guide to solve a problem. And of course, pretty much every facet of our lives today in some regard are controlled by algorithms. And as algorithms are becoming increasingly more pervasive, they're also becoming more complex because they're the foundation of machine learning. Because what they do is they find patterns in data and apply those patterns to make decisions. And with that level of complexity with machine learning is arising a new problem. And that problem in the tech community is called the black box problem. And the black box problem is essentially this notion that the brightest minds in AI, from IBM, Google, MIT, you name it, these guys can no longer explain how algorithms are making decisions. And the reason why this is scary is both the control that we've lost, but also because of how these algorithms have been coded from a single view of the human experience. Because this is largely what Silicon Valley looks like today. And despite our very best efforts, Diversity is still pretty dismal in Silicon Valley, specifically in artificial intelligence roles, where women hold less than 20% of these roles, people of color just a fraction of that, and LGBTQ people just a fraction of that. Now, the question is if you don't work in Silicon Valley, does this actually matter, and does this affect you? And it matters immensely to every single person today, because machines don't have values. The values that we tell machines, or the values that technologists tell machines, become their principles for right and wrong. And as humans, our principles are flawed. We all have unconscious bias, and it's simply not fair of us to expect that technologists should have a holistic view of the human experience. And I don't think that Silicon Valley's best and brightest talents are intentionally creating interfaces that are racist and sexist and homophobic. But if you put bias into something, you're gonna get bias out, unconscious though it may be. Which means that now the operating systems for our lives are now coded through a series of incomprehensible data and algorithm biases everywhere. As one example of this, in the exact same news cycle where LGBTQ creators were blocked from uploading to YouTube to just simply post celebratory content of their community, white supremacists were openly allowed to use the platform to promote hate speech. Apple, I think, is both the latest and potentially the most egregious example of algorithm bias gone wrong. So Apple came out with their credit card late last year, with a lot of fanfare behind it. And shortly after they came out with it, dozens of men came forward on Twitter and said that even in scenarios where their wives made more money than them, had better credit scores, they were filing joint tax returns together, their wives were receiving credit extensions of up to 20 times less than their husbands. To be clear, this wasn't just a bunch of random dudes on the internet, but Steve Wozniak, the co-founder of Apple, was affected by this with his wife. Voice, of course, is intended to be a human experience, right? It's intended to act like a person, specifically women. Most voice interfaces are a female-sounding voice. And the United Nations was intrigued by this because not only are most voice interfaces female-sounding, but most voice technologists are men, over 70% of them. So the United Nations did a study where they essentially sexually harassed voice assistants on end and found that pretty much every voice assistant responds in a way at enjoyment at being harassed, which has now caused the United Nations to deem voice technology to be dangerous and promote sexist stereotypes about women. And finally, facial recognition. And I'm sure a lot of you have seen in the news examples of algorithm bias gone wrong with facial recognition. These are just two of them, but I think they're one of the most dystopian examples. The example on the left is from a Russian software company where they say with 90% accuracy, they can detect what a LGBTQ person looks like, which of course is nonsense. And the other example is from a Chinese software company. And this Chinese software company is now potentially going to be used by the Chinese government. And this example is an example from them saying that they can now detect what a criminal looks like before they actually perform a criminal act. And both of these are minority report level terrifying because governments can now potentially use flawed data to profile people and potentially persecute or prosecute them. But they're also nothing new. This is just the modern application of something called physiognomy. And physiognomy was the 19th century pseudoscience that's been completely debunked today that says that you could infer something about someone's character based off of how they look. For example, criminals were thought to have large foreheads or hooked noses. Now, at this point, you are probably wondering what the hell does any of this have to do with advertising? Well, we are the grand financiers of this problem, making us just as powerful, if not more powerful, in the fate of human rights than governments, especially when you consider that the politicians in charge have zero clue what the hell is actually going on. Now, the final factor that we have to consider is that brands, and specifically and especially Unilever, have been making pretty forward attempts at showing more diverse representation in our ads. But the question is that will consumers even see our attempts at equality if the computers that are serving our ads don't have these same values? Or will all of this just be systematically annihilated on the basis of code? So with black box AI being the foundation for computational systems, with big tech's really big diversity problem, with diversity in media largely focused on creative representation today, is leading us to a future in which we are constantly teetering on the brink of societal regression on the basis of code. Now, algorithms that are funded by media dollars are so pervasive. They are the invisible strings that make the world dance today. And to each and every one of us, that's nothing new. We all live and breathe that every day. However, a skeptic might argue that algorithm bias existing to the extent that it does is hardly the ad industry's fault. But I think we had two really good intentions as an industry that directly contributed to algorithm bias or even created algorithm bias that didn't exist before. So first, we had relevancy. So today we have laws that protect against prejudice thinking, right? Thinking that someone is more relevant for a job based off of their age or their gender, or more relevant for a neighborhood based off of their skin color is, of course, illegal. But what's happening today is computers are now blatantly breaking these laws, and we as an industry are helping train those computers to do so. Because we tell our friends in tech all the time, every single day, that we want to reach a certain type of person. And we give them some of our data, maybe they use their data, they run that data through their algorithms, and they're training their algorithms to essentially make decisions based off of relevancy for a certain type of person, for a job or a product or a service or housing. And the outcome has been is that every single DSP and social platform has been found to discriminate off of age, race, gender, and income. And I know it's really, really hard to hear, but if anyone said any of these things in the real world, like, you're old, so you wouldn't like this cool tech product, you would definitely find that problematic at best or potentially illegal at worst. But insights like this are essentially the foundation of how digital advertising works. And second, on brand safety. With that increased level of automation, we had to have a new need for control. So what we did is we took a bunch of keywords and we put them into a keyword block list because we didn't want our brands to be funding extremism, right? And that was completely fair for us to do. But the problem is that keyword block lists unilaterally treat articles on the left as the same level of badness as the articles on the right, although a lot of brands probably are very aligned with the article on the left and would want to be surrounding that type of content to better integrate into that specific community. And this is underscored by a recent investigation that found that words that are relevant to the gay community are systematically placed higher on keyword block lists than words that are actually bad, like shooting, drugs, porn, and killing, which begs the question, is this really about protecting brands from extremism, or have we unfortunately let our unconscious bias infiltrate how we place media and created a level of algorithm bias that didn't previously exist? And the effect has been is that marginalized media has now been defunded based off of our brand safety protocols. So this is a future in which visible representation in ads won't matter because the computers that are now serving our ads won't have the same values that we do as people. Second, brand purpose and brand safety become part of the same conversation because, unfortunately, largely today, our brand safety guidelines are somewhat misaligned with what we say we stand for and our brand purpose statements. Which brings me to my third point. Advertisers will be red-henned according to their algorithmic practices. Going back to the last season of Media Dystopia, to be red-henned was to be ousted by a faction for a perceived value of where you stand politically. Consumers are becoming increasingly more literate about algorithmic practices in general. It's probably not too far off until they start understanding how things like brand safety guidelines and audience profiles actually contribute to a level of algorithm bias and potentially defund journalism at large. And then finally, and most critically, is that brands are more powerful in the fate of human rights than governments, which is largely already starting to happen today. Now, the good news is we are at 0 hour with this and we can fix it. I think we just need to display a level of bravery at dismantling some of the systems that either we contribute to or have created. And I think we probably need some level of governance with that. So I think maybe we need a technocratic oath where we pledge that we will buy no harm, because again, there's really no governance on any of this today. And despite everything that you just heard, I'm actually an optimist. And I'm an optimist because I think it's a lot easier for us to deprogram bias out of a computer than it is for us to deprogram hate out of a person. So maybe in like a weird way, algorithms could bring us to a level of a utopian future where brands can both better connect with people, but algorithms could also save us from a level of discrimination. Which brings me back to Dorothy and her library. In the midst of immovable Jim Crow laws and really long before the civil rights movement took place in the US, Dorothy was struck by a system that she could control, something that she could dismantle. So what she did is she actually just decided to place the books where she thought that they belonged, alongside each other on the bookshelf, setting off a slow burn of algorithm bias that we as marketers and as people have to reconcile with today. So how can Unilever prepare? First and foremost, diversity of people everywhere, but specifically in technology roles where diversity really is still so lacking at an industry level today. Second, be critical about the data you're using, how you're applying it, and what factors are really important. Which brings me to my third point, is thinking more and more about buying behaviors and not necessarily being beholden to audience segmentations, which will both allow us to think more about reaching people who are raising their hand and saying that they're interested in our brand, product, or category, but also help reverse some of the algorithm bias that brands at large contribute to. And then finally, and most easily, is just reevaluate your keyword block list to understand what unconscious bias has potentially infiltrated our brand safety protocols. Thank you.
You guys didn't clap when I finished my episode. I told you she was going to make you uncomfortable. But episode 3 is called The Price is Might. And in this future, in 2028, Kohl's, Target, and Best Buy all open at normal hours on the day that formerly had been known as Black Friday, while offering no price discounts. So a couple months ago, I did an experiment and tried to track every purchase that I made over the course of a week and how I made that purchase. So you guys get to see a week in the life of Joe. I'm going to read out to you every purchase that I made in that week. So I insert my Visa credit card while buying lunch near the office. I bought a pair of socks from an Instagram ad using Amazon Pay. I used Apple Pay at Dwayne Reed, which was verified by my Face ID. I paid $2.99 to watch an Arsenal Europa League game on Bleacher Report on my desktop, and my credit card info was auto-populated. I ordered from Seamless for dinner, and I paid through Venmo because a few months prior there was a promotion to switch your payment method to Venmo, and I guess I never switched it back. I upgraded my seat to Vegas using Air Miles. I put my credit card down at a bar for a tab and then got Venmo'd from 3 people the next day who were at the bar with me. I used the Curb app from the back of a cab on my mobile device. I had my Apple Pay automatically charge for my Patreon subscription to miniature painting videos. I bought my wife a gift at an Etsy pop-up where my card was authorized through Square. I told Alexa to order more dog treats, and I have no idea what credit card was charged. I bought this t-shirt from a UK e-commerce company, and I paid using PayPal. And I bought a movie ticket on Fandango, which was paid using a credit I didn't even know I had, and I still don't know where it came from. And that was just in 1 week. And keep in mind, I live in New York. If this was in some Shanghai or Singapore somewhere, it would be twice as many options. I also did go to a dim sum place that accepted only cash or Venmo. And in the craziest example of them all, I had to write a check to my landlord because the bastard still doesn't accept digital payments. The point here is that there are now almost infinite ways to pay for almost everything in our lives. And this is because for the last decade or so, there's been this silent war being fought between the established financial institutions and the upstarts and the disruptors who are trying to mix things up. And consumers are stuck in the middle but are reaping all of the benefits, while marketers are just trying to make sure that they don't get caught in the crossfire. Add to that now, in the last few months, institutions with massive, massive footprints who historically have nothing to do with finance are essentially making themselves finance companies. Rachel talked about the Apple credit card. Uber is now helping to finance people's rides. Grab is using a similar model in Asia. Finally, fighting back, the major credit card companies also in the last couple months have joined forces to compete directly with PayPal to create a one-click payment option. So you're going to start seeing that little icon on the left all across the digital web if this thing takes off. And even the owners of the points of purchase are starting to innovate, like Ahold is looking to drive more frictionless purchase through UPC scanners. But beyond just making purchases frictionless, what all this innovation is doing is to help overcome some of the historical barriers from people spending money. Or in this case, like sending money abroad. So Samsung Pay users in the US can send money to pretty much anyone, anywhere in the world using the Finabler tech network without any transaction fees. Another barrier is security, as biometrics are estimated to verify more than $2 trillion in payments by 2023, up from just over $100 billion this past year. Another barrier is even having money, as buy now, pay later companies like Klarna and Affirm are enabling people to defer payment completely without having to pay interest like they would on a credit card. They're making all of their money on the fees. And then you have the personal finance hacks like Honey, which is a browser plugin that every time you get to a digital checkout goes and scours the entirety of the web for a promo code for you to throw in so you could get a discount on whatever it is you're purchasing. And PayPal launched the Do Not Pay card, which enables you to sign up for a free trial, either a week or a month, and it will just automatically cancel that free trial once that week or month is over without getting your actual card charged. On top of all of that, the actual way we make payments are essentially becoming a media platform unto themselves. So you think about Mastercard turning all of their points of purchase into a audio branding opportunity, and the experience of Venmo, where you send money to someone else and also get to see all of your friends sending money to other people accompanied by a little caption or an emoji. And then you have Pinduoduo in China, which has improved on the Groupon model by making it more like a social platform. So with Pinduoduo, you find a product that you want, you sort of lock into it and share it out across the network, and the more of your friends who opt in to buy that product, the cheaper the product gets for everybody. It's a really cool model. So what does this mean? The innumerable ways to buy and pay, plus the merger of media and payments, plus the rise of self-sovereign digital identity leads to a future where that marketing P of pricing now becomes payment, and pricing power sits entirely in the hands of the consumer. So imagine a world where you, as a consumer, verify your purchase using some sort of biometric, either your face or your fingerprint, either on your mobile device or in store, and automatically an algorithm sorts through all of your finances to figure out the best method of payment, whether it's a credit card, a digital platform, whatever's going to get you the cheapest price, the most airline miles, the best loyalty points. In this world, the idea of costs becomes essentially we all have a self-optimizing payment system that consolidates for you what the choices that you would have to consciously make. And in this world, the idea of cost or price actually evolves to be something a little bit more, and you can start to look at more than just the number. So the Economy card, as an example, launched again in partnership with Mastercard, puts a cap on your monthly spending based off of your carbon impact. So you opt in for how much carbon impact you want to make towards the environment, and once you hit that on a monthly basis, you cannot spend with this card anymore. A slightly less dystopian version of that is the Cadbury pop-up store, which enabled you to buy chocolate with kindness. You didn't pay with cash, you paid with proof of kind acts that you had done for the world. So in this future, we're going to start to see the slow death of price promotions, because when everyone is getting self-optimized into the cheapest possible price promotions is no longer a motivator to drive people in-store or to on-site. But very importantly, payment method then will become a foundational aspect of audience planning, and it might become the first thing that we look at, how people pay for our products. And payment ease will be a major driver of consumer choice. But the challenge is that in this world, there are so many people who are getting in the middle of the transaction between a brand and a retailer and a consumer, which means there are lots of entities coming in and taking their cut along the way, and these layers of disintermediation is going to put a significant squeeze on margins in the long run, which means that we as marketers need to start thinking of revenue management not at the level of overall demand, but at the level of an individual. Now, this is obviously a potentially very scary future, but it does provide some opportunity, because maybe this means we could get to the nirvana of variable pricing, where we don't need to offer discounts to people who don't care about what they were paying in the first place. It means that if I am price blind, I will pay whatever, but if I am price sensitive, of course I've opted in to figure it out for myself. Of course, given what Rachel just said, this is a very dangerous world for marketers as well, because we don't want to get on the slippery slope where we are getting discriminatory or in any way predatory in our pricing, or potentially using our algorithms to discriminate against specific individuals based on race, gender, or lifestyle. But we have started to see a number of brands, largely in the travel category, but even in some others, start to experiment with different models of variable pricing. Even Bayer Crop Science is using a model that is based on yield, so literal crop yield, depending on, will influence what farmers are paying Bayer. While Uber, of course, is training consumers all over the world to be more than comfortable with surge pricing, which is just paying different prices for different things at different times. My favorite example of this is actually a highway outside of Washington, D.C. So normally there is an HOV lane where you have to have two people in the car to be able to drive in that lane. But now you can pay to drive in that lane even if you have only one person in the car, But the price for that highway is going to vary depending on the level of traffic. And thus far, the highest amount possible has been $82 to drive for a 2-mile stretch of highway to avoid the traffic, which, you know, Washington, D.C. bigwigs, I guess some of them have no problem paying. So how can Unilever prepare for this future? The first is to, in partnership with retail partners, obsess over making payment as easy as possible. Second is to diversify the first-party purchase-based data to account for the full range of payment methods. If we're looking at just Mastercard data to try and capture our audience insights, we're not getting a full view of potentially all the ways that consumers are paying for our stuff. Third is avoid the discount and start reimagining the promotional mechanisms to go beyond price. And lastly, mitigate that future margin squeeze by building incidental loyalty and, of course, reinforcing the brands. Because at the end of the day, a really strong brand will be worth paying for regardless of all of these mechanisms sitting in the background. So that is episode 3. I'm now going to hand it over to the most influential person that I know, which is Janet Levine.
So this episode is called Fire and Lice. And in this future, it's 2025, where Whiskey Electric, which is an influencer-driven bluegrass festival, eclipses Coachella as the world's top-grossing music festival, boosting sales of sponsors Levi's and Wild Turkey. Now, historically, the way that you gain influence is by being a genius, accumulating a ton of power, or having some profound impact on the world. But the internet democratized influence, and for the first time, regular people could post about regular things and be considered influential. It all started with this, the first YouTube video, where co-founder Jawed Karim is talking about, of all things in the world, elephants at the San Diego Zoo. Now, we recognize that the influencer industry is very strong and it's growing. Global ad spend's going to surpass $13 billion in just a few years. And today, brands like Estee Lauder are putting almost all of their digital dollars behind social media creators. But I think everyone on this terrace could agree that we can't keep looking at this industry through rose-colored glasses, even if they're being sold to us by our favorite fashionista, Karen Wazen. And that's because nowadays anybody can be an influencer. And we've created every type of tier to accommodate this, which means that you could have just a handful of followers and be considered a nano or micro influencer. So with all of these people coming into the fold, we've created this new problem for consumers. They're feeling this new disease called influencer fatigue. Nearly half of Americans are just tired of influencer content, whether that's the oversaturation in their news feeds, the repetitive posts, or the inauthenticity. The industry is also facing another problem, and that is rampant bot fraud. And brands are falling victim to this. This is a list of the top 10 brands that have the highest percentage of fake followers against a paid post. You can see P&G is right up there on the top with Febreze. And there's other big brands like Disneyland, of all places, Kroger and Zappos. But it's not just these 10 brands that are facing this issue. It was reported in 2019, as an industry, we will have spent $1.3 billion against fake followers and bots. Now, that means that we can add social media to the black market, along with weapons, drugs, and stolen goods. And that's because nowadays it is very easy to get fake followers. All you need is a little bit of money. But it's one thing to tell you about this, it's another thing to actually show you. So I went ahead and I created a fake account on Twitter. That's because I am an influencer now. And I went to Buzzoid, I paid $11.99 to get 1,000 followers in one day. By 2 hours in, I was over 500 followers, and by the next day, I hit over 1,100. But it kind of begged the question, who are all my legions of fans? Well, it didn't take me very long to figure out that I handed my credit card information over to a Middle Eastern bot farm. Now, if I'm gonna pretend to be famous and just acquire a ton of followers, this is no problem. I'll take them all day. But if I'm being hired to sell soap in the United States, you can see that I have a major dilemma on my hands. We also know that consumers are becoming increasingly more skeptical of influencers because we all know the great lengths and sometimes fraudulent and fake lengths that these influencers will take just to generate a like. For instance, we have Omar the construction worker. He is known as the anti-influencer because he would scour Instagram and try to figure out all of these influencer trends, and then he would mimic them, but he would do it dressed head to toe in construction gear. So everyone loved him until they realized that this was just a ploy for a local coffee shop in Texas. We have Kendall Jenner. She represents all of the celebrities who use their power to lure people to the Fyre Festival, which we all know how that ended up. That was the greatest scam disaster of our generation. And then we have Uwe Butler. He's out of the UK. He created the #1 restaurant in the UK. The problem with that, though, is that it was a totally fake restaurant fueled by fake social media reviews. And we had people nodding. He's incredible. But at the end of the day, a fake restaurant, rich kids stuck on an island, like there's no real harm that's happening there. But what happens when influencers use their power for harm? No better evidence than Logan Paul. He went to Japan's suicide forest, made jokes, taped content, it was horrific, and YouTube knew it and took it down immediately, but not before millions of people saw it. Look at the bottom chart. This is the impact that it had on traditional Google searches, that is searches for suicide forest. Now, he lost all of his sponsors and a ton of money, but guess what? A year later, he's more popular than ever. We also saw a lot of YouTubers exploit the topic of mental health. They created all of these videos saying, oh, I'm a social media star, all of the pressures, it's making me unwell. The problem is they never disclosed the fact that the only reason they were making these videos is to promote a shoddy self-help app called BetterHelp. So it's leaving consumers really confused. What's fake, what's real, what's organic, what's sponsored? And we're seeing these two worlds kind of emerge. On the one hand, we have celebrities who have real deals with brands, but on average of 58 sponsored posts, only 3 are FTC compliant. But on the other hand, we have influencers who are pretending to have deals with brands when they really don't have deals at all. Now, given the fact that there's the rise of micro-influencers and that anybody can be one, this is just way too many people for any one government entity to monitor effectively. So it leaves us in a place where we don't really know what's going on. We're kind of like in the Wild West. There's lack of formal guidelines and regulation. There's no transparency in data and pricing. But I think this view of the future is too generous. Instead, I believe we're living in a very dark version, the digital version of Westworld, where you can roam around and create a facade of whoever you want to be. You can live life without limits and have no rules. And you interact with people who you think you like, but they end up just being robots. Luckily for us, things are turning around, and that has a lot to do with you, right? You've taken giant measures, and you're a leader in the marketplace by stamping out fraud and increasing social media platforms that are leaning into not having fake followers. And the platforms have responded as well. They're purging bots by the millions and billions. And just to give you some scale, Facebook over the span of just a few months, cleared the population of China twice. That's 3 billion. I know that image is not China. I promise we're better at media than geography. But if you go to Instagram, they clear 95 million bots. That's the size of Vietnam. And Twitter, the size of the population of Thailand. So that's a ton. But they're not stopping there. They're also testing the removal of likes, which we believe will alleviate pressure for influencers. Now they can just post organically. They don't have to do any stunts or gimmicks just to get those numbers up. So what we're working toward is the widening authenticity gap that's leading to consumer skepticism, the vastly fraudulent and unregulated marketplace, combined with the proactive responses from platforms and marketers, all mean that the current definition of social influencers is going to be eclipsed by a new definition, one that's characterized by credibility, authenticity, and positive impact. Which brings us back to these three. I very much believe if they were alive today, they would be very critical over the partnerships that they entered into in the social media world. And they would really think about the content that they were putting out there to have the greatest influence. And if nothing else, they would abide by this new definition of what we're considering influential. And that's our responsibility to uphold as well. So this is a future in which the number of followers you have won't matter, because authenticity is going to be key. And simply put, you can't fake authenticity the way that you can fake reach, which also means that veracity is not going to be a concern. Again, with all of those pressures being alleviated with these influencers, they can be truthful and honest, and that means that we can align on a similar DNA to our brands. The first dollar spent will be on people talking about your brand, people who use your brand, people who love your brand. We'll consider all channels, even beyond social media where there's influence. And finally, we'll focus on experiences that anyone can participate in to exert their influence. Take, for instance, Taco Bell. They opened up a Taco Bell hotel in Palm Springs, and they could have invited any celebrity they wanted to attend, but instead they rewarded micro-influencers. So this was anyone from the couple who would always go through the drive-thrus and sing Disney parodies to the fan behind the cult account Taco Bell Sommelier. But experiences don't just have to be things. We love this example from Chanel. They created a fan account called We Love Coco that's on Instagram. It allows anyone to post UGC content about the brand. And what we love about this is they're giving as many people as possible the ability to exert influence over their brand, not just the one person they paid to do it. And finally, we spoke about leaning in very hard to people who use and love your brand. We're dubbing this the Ron Swanson philosophy, and I will let him take it away.
I won't publicly endorse a product unless I use it exclusively, and I really believe in it. My only official recommendations are U.S. Army-issued mustache trimmers, Morton's salt, and the C.R. Lawrence Fine 2-inch X-style scraper oscillating knife blade.
So very specific. So how can Unilever prepare? I mean, simply put, you're a leader in this, right? You know the influencer industry really well, and you're creating changes in the marketplace that everyone else is trying to emulate. So keep doing that. 2 is look for places and people, regardless of scale, where you're authentically being talked about and invest there first. Work to establish long-term relationships with influencers. And finally, consider affiliate marketing, where we can turn fans into true business partners.
All right, we're in the home stretch now. Episode 5 is called The Pivot to Print. And in this future, 2 things happen in 2025. Digital publishing platform Wattpad buys Viacom CBS for $25 billion, while Salesforce invests in what later becomes known as the first $1 million banner on the New York Times. So it's a great irony of the digital age that we have finally reached a point where we have near universal literacy, only to really not need to be able to read anymore to get by in the world. And largely, this is partially driven by our obsession with video. And by our, I don't mean consumers' obsession with video, I mean ours as marketers. In fact, maybe being more than obsessed, we're probably more like addicted to video. Pre-roll, post-roll, mid-roll, linear, addressable, connected. If it's video, we want it. It is like crack, put it straight into our veins. Take, for example, this unit, which is called the Twitter Booster Unit. It is an interruptive ad that puts content into a user's feed that they were not looking for, and then puts a 6-second pre-roll before that content. It is pre-roll before a pre-roll, or as I like to think of it, pre-roll inception. And this is the ultimate example of our addiction to video as marketers. And like any addiction, there are consequences for those around us. As since 2016, many, many digital publishers have pivoted to video and focused much more on producing video than producing written content. The most egregious of these was Fox Sports, who in 2017 simply eliminated the written word from their site overnight. And I mean literally, on a Tuesday night, they fired everyone at the company who was responsible for typing words, and on the next morning, the only thing on the site was video. In fact, since in the last 10 years, the number of journalists working in the United States has gone down by more than half, and even Condé Nast, the venerable pillar of journalism, is now seen internally as a video-first company where anything other than video was irrelevant. And even just the ways that we communicate as humans doesn't really require words anymore. We can FaceTime with each other, or we can communicate entirely with emojis. So given all of this, you might be tempted to think that we have essentially thrown out the foundation of civilization in exchange for cat videos and an endless stream of ads before ads. Luckily, though, you would be wrong, because for the first time in a number of years, in 2018, sales of printed books actually went up, and that was despite a crunch on the printers themselves because of all of the unexpected demand. And book clubs are seeing a renaissance as a number of celebrities are capitalizing on the rise in reading overall. And to go back to Condé Nast, their single most profitable title happens to be The New Yorker, the one that is most dedicated to the written word. And it's from the pages of that magazine and the New York Times where we can see the real power of print. As the Me Too movement was kicked off and Harvey Weinstein, a monster, was taken down by a long-form piece of journalism that really, truly demonstrated what the written word can do. But aside from all of that power, the other fact is sometimes video just sucks. I guarantee everyone here has at some point clicked on a link hoping to read an article and arrived at a video which you immediately closed and did not watch. So maybe over all this time, the way that we were thinking about video as marketers was wrong. Maybe it wasn't all about the power of sight, sound, and motion. It was about the scarcity and the quality of that sight, sound, and motion. Because historically, video has been harder to produce and it's been more expensive, and thus it was more scarce and of higher quality. But now in a world where everyone and anyone can produce a video, maybe these two channels and formats have actually switched roles. And because at the end of the day, it's actually the thought and work that's put into art that makes it valuable, not the format that it is in. Now you might be thinking, hold on a second, there is a ton of shit content that is written all over the internet, like which Taco Bell item speaks to you on a spiritual level. I don't know what mine is, but I've been trying since I've started giving this presentation to figure it out. But we might actually have a solution for that, as a number of people are trying to fix this as well. So Balaji Srinivasan, who is the former CTO of Coinbase, is working on a project or an idea that he thinks of as ad block, but for clickbait, making sure that we're amping up the quality of the written word. And another endeavor called Poet is trying to create what you could think of as nutritional facts for content all over the web. So you can see which verifiable sources and of what quality are linking to and from that piece of content as a consumer. So what all this means, between the new scarcity of quality text content, plus ubiquitous video that anyone can produce, and consumer-centric tech applications, leads to a future in which text-based content returns to being the most premium, most powerful media format. Now, to be honest, I am not talking about this type of text-based content. Newspapers are dead. The delivery mechanism is just too slow. But what I am talking about is people reading, and that is because reading itself is like the bicycle. The bicycle was a revolutionary invention at its time. Man had never gone so fast on its own. People thought it was going to make horses go extinct. But then when the moving vehicle came around, people thought that the bicycle would go extinct because the car just went so much faster. But if you think about it more than a century later, the bicycle still thrives and in fact in many ways is seen as preferable to the moving vehicle because it's better for you as an individual, it's better for us as a society, and it's literally better for the earth. And that is because the bicycle itself is what Nassim Taleb would call anti-fragile. It is something that thrives through volatility by finding a specific use case that is much more valuable to all of us. And reading is the same. Reading will thrive through the post-video world despite Madison Avenue's best effort to prioritize sight, sound, and motion. And what we think its sort of niche is going to be is expertise, because reading has the opportunity to provide the place where people who are most expert put their words down on paper or a digital screen. And this is because in this world, reading becomes a signal of a person's greatest interest. The ability to read someone who has invested the time and effort to read something rather than just see whatever video happens to be popping up in their feed. And in this world, writers then become the ultimate influencers because they are taking their expertise and putting it out and sharing it with the world. And in this world, less relevant to you guys, this means writing and reading in particular becomes a B2B goldmine, as every B2B marketer in the world needs to find answers to questions that they don't want to have to sit through a video to find. This also means that we need to redefine what we think about as content optimization, not just what we have on our own sites, but where we go out in the world. So imagine a world where things like franchise positions and roadblocks come back as brands start to roadblock specific writers or specific topics all over the quality written web, which is how Salesforce comes to buy the first $1 million banner on the New York Times as they take their altruistic vision and realize that they need to invest in journalism and specific topics and roadblock all of those on specific writers. Lastly, this is also a world where there will be the opportunity, going back to our first episode, to invest on the ground floor of some of these very small micro-content that ultimately will grow into larger franchises. Take, for example, the story of Anna Todd. She started writing One Direction fan fiction on Wattpad. And for those of you who don't know, Wattpad is essentially the YouTube for writing. It's largely a teen-focused platform. She started writing this One Direction fan fiction on her phone while commuting back and forth from work. It became so popular that she wound up getting a book deal and turned it into a book called After, which was licensed and came out as a movie earlier this year, made $100 million at the global box office. There's a sequel in development. And fans have come to love After so much that they have started adopting the characters and creating fake avatars of them all across social media, which brands like Starbucks and Applebee's are now interacting with to try and reach some of these young consumers. Now think of the opportunity that those brands or any brand could have had if they were investing in Anna Todd and After at the very early start on the digital publishing platform, rather than trying to chase the ghost of what people are now interested in. So how can Unilever prepare? The first and perhaps most importantly is to invest in journalism, both to make sure that it's saved and we have a journalistic society, but also to make sure that it stays ad-supported and doesn't wind up completely behind a paywall only for the people who can pay. Next is to perfect your static and audio messaging to be able to maintain franchise positions. So our Neural Lab and our Content Plus team is working with Teeds to try and finally crack the banner, to figure out how we can make a banner that is worthy of being in some of these high-quality environments. Third is find and own the most valuable text content across all of those CPG categories. And lastly, start to place some bets for the long term on some of these franchise seeds like we saw with Wattpad. So that's episode 5, which brings us now to the end, our final episode, which is called Endgame. And in this future, in 2040, half of today's top 100 brands either cease to exist completely or subsist solely on the scraps discarded by the other half of the brands. I know it's a little overdramatic, but we're trying to go out with a big finish. So the entire exercise of media dystopia, while thinking about the future of media, has really been about answering the question of what comes after modern marketing. And to answer that, we need to take a step back and think about what came before modern marketing. So at the risk of creating a straw man, if we think about the history of marketing in 2 ages, we had the classical age dating all the way back to newsreaders in ancient Rome saying what was the best sandal shop. And this, all the way up to the early days of digital with banners, this was characterized largely by big, insightful brand messages. And then we have the modern marketing age, kicking off around the time of the launch of the iPhone, which is characterized by data and targeting and a buzzword called personalization. In the last few years, there has been a lot of tension between these 2 ages as marketers grapple with what is really the right mix of things and what do we need to adopt in the modern marketing age. But what if the problem was not the difference between traditional and digital or brand building and performance, but it was that we were dragging forward the artifacts of classical marketing that weren't really able to work in the modern marketing world? Because the other difference between these 2 ages is in what we could know. In the classical marketing age, everyone had a shared uncertainty about what worked and who exactly we were reaching, and we were comfortable in that uncertainty because everyone else was in the same boat. But the modern marketing age, since the beginning of digital, it seems that marketers, brands, and agencies are all trying to achieve some end state. If I could just gather enough first-party data, if I could just get my tech stack in place, if I could just in-house the commoditized aspects of my business. And even if you think about the words we use to describe modern marketing, targeted, data-driven, single source of truth, precision, they all seem to be striving towards this certainty that may not even be possible. Now, for any fans of The Good Place, can tell you, striving towards certainty can lead you to a very bad place. But the question is, somebody got that joke, I appreciate it. But the question is it even possible? And we don't think it's possible because we are not in the end game and there is no end state. To begin with, the modern media world is conspiring to make certainty an absolute impossibility just by the nature of the platforms. All of the movement is moving away from mass ad-supported into either niche ad-free content or both of those, I guess. The next thing is the entry points into consumer content is largely being confined to a finite set of ecosystems, either the franchises that individuals become obsessed with, or the platforms themselves like WeChat or Grab or Amazon, or in some cases both like Fortnite. There's also no certainty in how they're going to engage with us after we've spoken to them. So voice interfaces and facial recognition and biometrics are all putting all of the control in the hands of the consumer, where they are in complete and utter control of how they interact and transact with us. And finally, there's no certainty in how channels actually work. It's said that it takes at least a generation for civilization to figure out the best use of every new medium, which is why for 50 years after the printing press, the only thing it was used for was the Bible and pornography. Now consider the fact that digital is not a new medium. It's actually a replacement for and consolidation of all of the mediums that came before. So while consumers are still trying to figure it out, we as marketers think we know where it's all going to end up, but the dust hasn't settled. But once the dust settles and we live in a fully addressable world, we will actually be able to use channels for the intrinsic value that they bring and the jobs that they can do, and we'll no longer be faced with the false choice of a targeted channel versus a reach channel. Instead, we can deploy audio when we want to build specific memory structures, or we can target print when we want to tap into some level of expertise, or we can even continue to use video when we want to build an emotional or rational message. But the question is, in this future with so many variables and permutations, are we building an algorithm biased towards a future that will never exist based on a past that didn't really work? Right now, all of the complexity sits in the process, and it's activated simply. The Rube Goldberg machine of modern marketing is still pulling from the artifacts of classical marketing, things like brand keys and brand essences and reasons to believe. What instead we might need is a simple process that enables us to activate with complexity to engage with all of the diverse experiences in media. So bringing it all together, between the negligible opportunities to reach people en masse, consumers being confined to a finite set of ecosystems, the infinite means of consumer interaction and transaction, and media formats being embraced for their intrinsic ability and not simply reach, leads to a future in which postmodern marketers dominate the media dystopia by embracing and thriving in uncertainty. And how do we thrive in uncertainty? And I think how we thrive is by rejecting some of those universal truths that we took as gospel through the classical marketing age. I have 3 examples. The first is the phrase, fewer, bigger, better. We don't think it applies anymore because in a world in which there are infinite consumer experiences and how they interact with our brands, should we really be doing fewer things? In a world where it's almost impossible to reach any sort of audience of any sort of scale, should we really be making bigger things? And better, yeah, better is good, but really what we meant by better was easier. So we think that fewer, bigger, better is replaced by bolder, faster, and more, in which brands must diversify their efforts to achieve a greater number of more specific objectives. The second universal truth is how we approach our audiences. For 50+ years, we have been trying to activate our audience into a single person. We create personas and sometimes segmentations, but then we talk about them. We say who our consumer is, not who our consumers are. But philosopher David Hume said that each of us is a bundle of ever-changing impressions, meaning that each individual himself or herself is many, many things. So how could we boil down an entire market audience into a single persona? The last universal truth to be able to activate truly against all of the various types of people out there in the world is how we activate our brands and our messages. The truth is, we still spend a lot of time thinking about the single thing we want to say and then cast it out on the waves like a message on a bottle, and we convince ourselves that we are doing personalization by changing the color of the bottle. In the future, postmodern marketers will create multi-dimensional brands, which need to be leaned into and embraced to deliver against all of the infinitely unique attributes of our consumers. Now, this doesn't mean trying to be everything to everyone, but I think this is where you guys are sort of ahead of the game, because if a brand has a purpose instead of simply an essence, that purpose is the thing that they can rely on, the rock on which everything else is built, which enables them to have many more different, more compelling conversations with different types of consumers who are asking different things of our brands. But this is a future in which we will expect fast and frequent failures. As we are looking for new opportunities for growth, we will be trying to find things all over the map and all over the consumer landscape, which means many of those things might not work. This is also a future in which accumulated data automatically decreases in value because at some point everyone's going to have all of the same data and we're just going to be trading things, essentially we'll have just what our competitors do. This is also a future where the question of in-housing versus agencies doesn't really matter because the power is going to be how are we right-housing for diversity? How do we make sure that we have the number of people who are bringing different perspectives to the table to be able to ask those different questions? And lastly, in this future, AI becomes largely irrelevant because what AI can do is help to continue to answer the questions that we've already asked. When this future, we nearly need to be asking different questions, which means that the idea of something like optimization will evolve into de-optimization. Currently, we try and pursue certainty by putting things into the stuff that we know works. But once we get that certainty, the world will be about taking money out of the things that we know work and putting them into different, more specific jobs to try and find other opportunities and areas for growth. This strategic risk-taking will provide the one thing that optimizations can't, which is upside. Every great brand has had the benefit of some sort of serendipity in the past, whether it's an unexpectedly amazing brand message or coming along at just the right time. But if we become obsessed with optimizations, there will never be any upside in our marketing, and we will always be sort of achieving the lowest common denominator, which our competitors also will. So in this future, our plans evolve to not really be plans, but to instead be ever-cutting and ever-evolving looks at our consumer. So on the one hand, on a Monday, we might look at how they feel emotionally. And on Tuesday, we might look at how all of them buy our product. And on Thursday, we might look at what are the cultural differences in what they're looking at. And on Friday, we might look at how much they even care about our categories. And we should never get to the end of this consumer rainbow, because all the answers we can get to who our consumers are should never stop us from immediately asking the question again. So how can Unilever prepare for this future? This number one, through the hub, multiply your segmentations and discard those singularly designed targets. Second is continue to prioritize brand purpose. Third, build the system to be anti-fragile through diverse perspectives and applications. And lastly, implement an uncertainty minimum in today's plans. So to wrap up, as Luis mentioned at the start, this is our final season. But in episode 1, I talked about how every consumer now gets what they want, and we think that also applies to marketers. So the reason we're not doing a 4th season is because we want to shift to creating bespoke media dystopias for our clients, specific to their categories and their brands. So we're launching a new offering to do exactly that, kicking off with a workshop and then working with you over several months to create your own media dystopia. There's also more information that can be found. If you want to actually watch the videos from the first 2 seasons, they are on mediadystopia.com. You can also sign up for our newsletter there. We send it out once a month, which is all sort of pondering and ruminations on the stuff we talked about. We also have a Media Dystopia playlist on Spotify if you want to listen to that through the rest of your CES trip. Lastly, I will leave you with this, which is a quote from an op-ed in the 1930s in which the writer laments the rise of sliced bread. And his big problem with sliced bread is the fact that the people who like sliced bread can't properly explain the thing that they like about it, why they are using sliced bread. The point here is if we look for an explanation of everything, if we try and put certainty into every system, we will never get cool stuff. So as you guys finish off CES, I will leave you with this thought, which is unlike in science fiction, where part of the journey is always the end, the cool thing about traveling towards the future of marketing is that we are always at the beginning of the journey. So with that, thank you very much.